Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you here today, this evening. Thank you for coming. My name is John Tyndall. I'm the Irish-British Victorian scientist who did the experiments to work out that there was a greenhouse effect. I also worked out why the sky is blue. Now, I'm here at the invitation of ClimateUEA to host this event, and I'm really pleased to be here because for Halloween, I was in the White House with my colleague in heaven, Eunice Foote. And Eunice herself worked on greenhouse gases at the same time as I did, but nobody really knew because she was an American woman. Anyway, we were going to haunt the White House, but we found it to be a ghoulish nightmare already. So I decided to come here and host this instead. So I will try to remain in character throughout the evening, but I should point out that since last time I was on Earth, I have lost a bit of weight. So if you see me hitching the trousers or sitting down quickly, it's because there's a cameraman here. And also, this is being filmed for YouTube. So whether I'm wearing underpants or not, I don't think is what I wish to be the meme of this event. So thank you very much for coming. And we have, or hopefully you all have clickers. Has everybody got a clicker? Hold up your clicker if you have a clicker. Good. So this is an event with lots of interaction. We're interested in what you think, because we know what we think. And there'll be discussion, there'll be clickers. And I would also like to point out that we're here to understand net zero, what the targets are, what different targets might be. So despite me haunting the White House, this isn't a political event. So please bear that in mind when you're having your discussions and having your using your clickers as well. So I think that probably the first thing we should do really is to check that the clickers work, because you know, in your modern ways you have these technology and it often lets us down. So I've got too many things to be holding here. The first question is, I can work out where that is. Well, yes. So apparently nowadays, in 2019, there's, I don't know, something called the interweb or something like that. And you can please do tweet or reproduce what the discussion. So hashtag NetZero and at ClimateUEA. But for testing my clickers, if I can do it. This is why we need to. So we're going to test the clickers. So first of all, who are you? I've said who I am. So who are you? So A, if you're faculty. B, if you're a researcher. C, if you're a student. D, if you're a normal Norwich person.
Where's the other?
Or other. So let's have a practice, and we'll just check that the clickers are working. How many people are here? 200? Okay, right. So please do vote. The vote is open, it's closed, and we had mostly students. That's interesting. So a few faculty, a few researchers, students, and normal Norwich people. So I in particular welcome the normal Norwich people. It's nice, and others. Nice to have some normal Norwich people here. And yeah, interesting. There's nearly half of you are students. John Tyndall was actually a sort of self-educated Irishman, British Irishman, became the director of the Royal Institution in London, which is where you see the Christmas lectures from there. Did all these experiments, not only with greenhouse gases, one of these Victorian scientists, did lots of mountaineering, professor. And was self-educated, learned all on his own without any tutors or teachers. I'm not comparing that to UEA. I'm just saying that he was self-educated. Right. I'm going to introduce my, or not my speakers now, the speakers. And first of all, we have Corinne Le Quéré here, who I think some of you know, former director of the Tyndall Centre, still working here at the University of East Anglia, and Professor Rupert Read, who's in the philosophy department as well, and is the founding chair of the Greenhouse think tank, among other accolades. It's one of these, if I went through both their accolades, we'd be here for the next little while speaking about that. One of the things we're going to do now we've worked out that the clickers are going to work, is we're going to do this and then we're going to do it afterwards. So, you have to be here doing a bit of science, doing a bit of experimentation. So we will be seeing whether your views change through the course of the event. So please could you, again using the clickers, let us know whether the overall opinion, what is your opinion of the UK net zero carbon reduction target? Is it A, the target should be 2030 or sooner? B, 2050 target is fine with me at the moment? And C, don't know, scientists and politicians should decide for me. So, A, B, or C, please vote. Please vote now. We'll go with these questions for now. So these are the questions for now. So A, B, C, vote now, and then when I click on, it closes the vote. So you definitely need to vote when I say vote. Otherwise, you don't get the option. Everybody voted? Then, so by far, 80% of people, target should be 2030 or sooner, 15%, 250 target is fine with me, and C, don't know, scientists and politicians should decide for me. Okay, so we'll come back to this at the end, basically to see if the next 2 hours of your life make any difference to you at all. So we'll be testing that rigorously. I think now I will stop talking and hand over to the speakers. So Corinne, you have 3 minutes, please, just to give us your opening, setting the scene, and then followed by Rupert. So please, Corinne.
Thank you, Asher. So not part of my 3 minutes. It's super interesting that most people don't think scientists and politicians should decide. Before I start, also I'd like to say that I'm here in my capacity as an academic tonight. I wear lots of hats, and this is my hat for tonight. I'm incredibly pleased, in fact, to be taking part in this discussion with Rupert Read tonight. Not because it's Rupert, actually that part is a little scary, but because we're having a discussion on the date of net zero. And I think, in fact, that we have come a long way in addressing climate change in spite of what it looks like. We have the Paris Agreement. We have made a start. And all my life I have argued with climate change deniers. And today I get to discuss with Rupert. Our emissions, so in order to tackle climate change, to stop the planet from further warming, the emissions of greenhouse gases need to come down to net zero. That means any emissions that are remaining in the atmosphere need to be offset by taking CO2 and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So our emissions come from transport, building, industry and power, and how we use land. So there is no mystery there. And here is my pitch of what are we going to do in the next few decades to tackle these emissions. Transport is easy. In city centers, we can walk and cycle, and for this we need to secure the funding, build the cycle path, promote the idea, change the culture. In cities and suburbs, we can use shared transport, secure the funding, expand the network, improve the service, change the culture. Outside cities, cars and vans go electric, secure the funding, build charging points, subsidize electric cars until the price goes down enough, recycle batteries, trucks go on hydrogen, secure the funding, produce the hydrogen, phase out petrol and diesel engines. As an extra, we get clean air and quiet cities. Now buildings, that's heating mainly, 25 million homes. Secure the funding. Insulate all roofs, most walls. Install digital kit to be more efficient. produce heat pumps approaching millions per year, build skills, install heat pumps, refit bigger radiators, in places develop heat network, in places heat with hydrogen, phase out gas boilers, build ultra-efficient new homes, check performance. As an extra, we get more comfortable homes. For power and industry, build the electric capacity with wind offshore and onshore, solar power, some nuclear, biomass, hydroelectricity, strengthen the grid, develop storage and peak demand management. In industry, use electricity where possible, hydrogen where not possible, develop carbon capture and storage, using the know-how of the fossil industry, fit carbon capture and storage on biomass power station to create a carbon sink to offset the emissions from aviation so I can go and visit my daughter in America. For land, we improve our health first. Eat more vegetable, less meat and dairy. Grilled vegetable lasagna, bean burger, falafel, hummus, poke bowl, chips and beans on toast. Chefs become creative in the vegetable department that releases land. We plant trees, expand woodland, and create habitat for birds and hedgehogs. We harvest some wood, use wood in construction, expand the wood industry, restore peatland, restore other habitats, and as an extra, we increase our resilience in climate change. Meanwhile, we work with our friends internationally. We build alliances, support developing countries. We do not focus on the United States this year. Every 5 years, the Paris Agreement becomes stronger. Fossil fuels subsidies disappear. Countries implement their commitments into laws. Global reforestation is on the way. The tide turns. This is a world where children go to school on Fridays. It takes time and it takes preparation. The plan needs to be detailed. The funding needs to be raised. The costs and efforts need to be distributed fairly. New opportunities will appear, sure, but the markets and industry need to prepare for change. The scale of change is unprecedented. We urgently need a detailed plan, and action needs to start now so we deliver net zero emission as soon as possible, but no sooner than that. Tonight I will explain why I think about 2050 is in fact a reasonable date for net zero full greenhouse gases in the UK, and that we should in fact be focusing on the plan of action. Thank you for now.
Thank you, Corinne.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'd like to start out by echoing what Corinne said. It's super that we're having this debate as opposed to some other kind of less interesting or useful debate. And I'm looking forward to the collegiality of it. Here's my take on what the debate is really about. Thinking of the two dates. Is 2025 achievable? Is 2050 sufficiently ambitious? I'll give you my answer to the first question later. I'm going to explain now why I think the answer to the second question is unfortunately not. So, why I can't accept the 2050 target, the target that the Committee of Climate Change on which Corinne sits recommended to the government, and that the government then, in a certain slightly unsatisfactory way, legislated for. So here's a quote from the Committee on Climate Change report. Corinne gave you this impressive list of things that we should do, and in some ways very inspiring. If all those things were done, and if that were replicated across the world, coupled with ambitious near-term reductions in emissions, reaching the 2050 target would, quote, deliver a greater than 50% chance of limiting temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. So 1.5 degrees is the figure that many scientists believe is a sort of upper limit of what's safe for our atmosphere. So if we do what Corinne recommends on her timetable, we get a greater than 50% chance of staying safe. So imagine that you're thinking of taking a flight. Hopefully you won't, but imagine that you are. And imagine if the vendor of the ticket tells you, this is a brilliant, brilliant airline I'm sending you on here. There's a greater than 50% chance that you're going to arrive. That isn't a ridiculous analogy for what we're being told here. The 2050 target means that this emergency, remember that Parliament has declared that we're in a climate and environment emergency. The 2050 target means that we would be making that emergency worse for the next 31 years. Now, I don't believe that that's a great way of staying safe. I want to mention this recent publication by a colleague of mine, some of you may have heard of, Tim Jackson, Zero Carbon Sooner, the case for an early zero carbon target for the UK. This is a very interesting new piece of work because it's one of the first pieces of work that actually argues that the 2050 target is not stringent enough and that we need something much closer to 2025. And what Tim points out is that if we take climate justice seriously, if we take our historical responsibility for emissions seriously, remember that the Industrial Revolution started here. We've got all this kind of accumulated advantage from all these accumulated emissions from a long time. If we take those things seriously, and if we include in our emissions, and we'll come to this, not just the emissions that get produced here, but the emissions that get consumed here, and we'll go into some other complications of the situation. And if we're serious about staying safe, then actually our target will be way sooner than 2050. In fact, here's what Tim Jackson says. For a linear reduction pathway, we can talk about that if you want, the difference it makes whether you go down like this or whether you go down steeper or more convexly. For a linear reduction pathway, not to exceed the carbon budget, the target year would have to be 2025, which just so happens to be the Extinction Rebellion target and the one that I'm arguing for here tonight. So that's really the nub of my case. The question will of course be raised, and I've already hinted at it, but is this even possible? So I'm going to give a fuller answer to that in the course of the evening. But the first remark I'd like to make about this is this whole thing depends kind of through which end of the telescope you look. And I think Corinne wants us to look through the end of the telescope of how can we preserve a life that is something like the life that we currently live. And you hear that, for example, in the Committee on Climate Change recommendation, which Corinne mentioned, to have electric cars replacing our existing car fleet. But what if that isn't radical enough? What if we need to, for example, radically reduce the amount that we travel at all? And do most of our travel that we do by foot or by bike or by public transport or possibly by horse, things like that. It depends which end of the telescope you look through. If you look through the end of the telescope that says we have to preserve something like our current way of life as it is, then maybe you plump for 2050. But it's not safe. If you look through the end of the telescope that says we want to survive and we want to bequeath a living planet to our children and grandchildren, then I think you go for something like 2025. That's what myself and my think tank call facing up to climate reality. If you want to learn more, I don't have more time now right on this, but if you want to learn more, I happen to have some copies of the book to sell at the end of the evening, so come on down and get one of those if you wish. That's the nub of my case here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert. So we heard really very interesting and perhaps not as contrasting as we would think opening statements there from Corinne and Rupert, so thank you for that. And now I would really like them to sort of delve a bit deeper perhaps, and sort of having set the scene, it's what should be included in a net zero target, and then we'll be coming back and asking you some of these questions as well. And I mean, to frame all of this as well, I think we have to remember that the UK government is the first in law to have such a target. And so now we're discussing some of the detail and maybe not differing opinion, but some of the detail in that as well. So did you want to respond on any of those?
I have lots to say, but I will say them in the course of
okay, that's fine. So like I say, we're going into what the net zero carbon target should include now, and to get into a bit more detail, having sort of started at the top there, Corinne, would you want to sort of get a bit more into the detail, and then to Rupert as well, please?
Yeah, well, this is where it becomes more interesting, I think. So, given we're talking about something like a target year for reaching net zero, it's really important to understand what it is actually that we're committing for. To be able to judge that, we need to first decide what is included in the target and what that means. There are net zero targets in other countries, for example, France, New Zealand, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and also California and New York. The states have net zero targets, but most of these targets differ in a number of ways. And these number of ways actually make easily 1 to sometimes more decades difference in the effective target that they're aiming for. So the first point that is important to decide is whether the target should be for CO2 only, which is the main greenhouse gas, is the gas that powers energy mostly, the gas that is behind transport, behind industry, as opposed to other greenhouse gases, particularly methane, that is used in agriculture. And so for this to decide whether we need a target for CO2 or all greenhouse gases, we need to understand what those gases do. So CO2 is a long-lived greenhouse gas. So once you put it in the atmosphere, it stays in the atmosphere for over 100 years. In fact, there's a part of the CO2 that is put in the atmosphere stays much, much longer than this. So CO2 is really important. And in fact, to stop further warming, CO2 needs to come down to zero, net zero, which is anything that is positive zero needs to be offset by active removal of CO2. That's also true for other long-lived greenhouse gas like nitrous oxide, which is used as fertilizer in agriculture, but it's much smaller than CO2 in terms of the total emissions, and other long-lived greenhouse gases like freons and so on. So this basket of long-lived greenhouse gases, they're the ones that scientifically, especially for a very early net zero target like 1.5 degrees, they need to be put down to zero. And while you do this, for having this, essentially the goal is to stop further warming. So the planet is warming, we've had 1 degree of warming, and so you bring these gases down to zero, the long-lived greenhouse gases, and the warming is stabilized under the conditions that other greenhouse gases, the short-lived greenhouse gases, their emissions don't need to go down to zero, but they do need to decrease. Now, exactly whether the temperature continues, rises a little bit or decreases a little bit depends on all kinds of other things like aerosols in particular. So in practice, there is no detriment. So the gas that we need to bring down to zero are the long-lived greenhouse gases, CO2 in particular, mostly CO2. But if we do the other gases, then it also helps. And so in practice, there is no detriment to aim for all greenhouse gases to cut net zero, as long as you can have offsets. So as long as for any of the remaining emissions that we put in the atmosphere, we have a way to extract emissions. Because we have to acknowledge that some emissions we cannot bring down to completely zero. So some emissions in agriculture, at the moment, we don't know how to bring down to completely zero. And emissions from aviation, at the moment, we don't know how to bring them down to completely zero, other than shutting down the aviation industry completely. So if you're not prepared to do this, then you have to find a way to offset these greenhouse gases. To limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, net zero emissions is needed around year 2050, globally that is, for CO2 emissions only, and 20 years later, so 2070, for all greenhouse gases. So if you have a target for all greenhouse gases, like the target for the UK, and you have a target that is 2050 all greenhouse gases, you're essentially 20 years earlier than what is required globally to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees with a 50% probability. To limit below 2 degrees, then it's much later. It's 2075 for CO2. And in fact, you don't need to have a net zero at all for all greenhouse gases this century. So to be aligned with the science, a net zero targets for all long-lived greenhouse gases is needed, with cuts in short-lived greenhouse gases. And having different targets for greenhouse gases could be quite confusing. So I think that one target, all greenhouse gases in the UK, is in fact quite challenging. Now, other questions that explains the difference between countries is, should aviation and shipping be included? So national aviation and shipping is already included in national targets, in UK target. But the question is whether international aviation, so those planes that come here and go to other countries, should they be included, even though some of the passengers and some of the cargo are not necessarily for UK services. And there are offset. The argument against this is that they're already covered by international mechanisms for offset, particularly aviation. So the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, CORSIA, is there for that. But the argument against this is that their objectives, the international mechanisms at the moment, their objectives is much weaker than what the UK is prepared to do. And so if the UK wants to be consistent with its own target, then international aviation and shipping should be included in the UK target. International carbon credits. So a net zero, I said already, a net zero means that we need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. How do we do this? So the simplest way is to plant trees. So replant forests so that we have a natural carbon sink. But the demand for this carbon removal is very big. And there is one technology at the moment that is particularly promising, which is that of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So you grow your forest, you harvest some of the wood, you use not the wood or the residue of the forest, you use this to produce bioenergy, you capture the carbon and you store it underground, and that gives you some energy plus a carbon sink. And for both this scheme and for reforestation, the UK is not necessarily the best place to plant trees or to do these carbon sinks. And so there would be a possibility to actually pay other countries to plant forests in their countries. And is this acceptable or not acceptable? And I think that actually this is acceptable as a mechanism, but it should not be in the target. It should be in addition to the target. But the target is not really credible if we don't try to do it on land here. And the final point is the consumption emissions. So these are emissions that are associated with goods and services that are produced elsewhere but consumed in the UK. So typically China or India produce some textile, we buy the jumper and we use it here. They get to be charged the emissions, but we get the pleasure. So these emissions are monitored in the UK, but they're not included in national target. This follows UN guidelines. This is how the UN operates. Arguments against including these emissions are that those emissions, they're difficult to measure. They are actually genuinely difficult to measure. Nothing is produced very simply nowadays. Even if the t-shirt is produced in India, where is the cotton coming from? And to keep track of all this is really quite difficult. We also don't control these emissions, and it is therefore difficult to set objectives that you don't control because you don't have actually leverage to operate on them. However, many of the measures that I mentioned in my opening statement lead to decreases in emissions both in national and in consumption. For example, everything that has to do with the demand, everything that has to do with reducing energy, increasing energy efficiency reduces both sets of emission. Also, when all the world is on track to net zero, then imported emissions will decrease naturally. It seems to me that now is not the time to include these consumption emissions for the elements that I mentioned now, leverage and the difficulty of accountability, but that we could start thinking about them. We could start looking at leveraging international trade agreements, for example, to encourage further international progress.
Corinne, I'm going to ask you to pause there. I think we'll be getting into lots of detail and we can bring things out in a further discussion. Is that okay?
I'm finished, actually.
Thank you.
So.
Yeah. Rupert, please.
Yeah. Okay, so I agree with some of the things that Corinne said there, but I do have some fairly fundamental concerns also. I would say that it is essential for us to include aviation and shipping, and essential for us to include consumption emissions. And I regret that the Committee on Climate Change and the government are not willing to do that, at least not yet. The basic reason is that if we don't include those things, then there's a serious risk that the current situation will continue. By the current situation, what I mean is a situation in which basically what happens is that the government goes around saying, we've got this wonderful record on reducing carbon emissions, and they're able to say that because they leave out the consumption emissions and the aviation and shipping, both of which have gone up enormously in recent years, and which, in the case, in both cases, this country is a particularly egregious offender, worse than almost any other country in the world. In other words, it skews the figures more for Britain than for most other countries to exclude those figures. So that would be my basic point there. I think we have to include them all if we're going to be honest, if we're not going to lie with statistics. In terms of the specifics of aviation, I do think it's very hard to see how we get to maintain much of an aviation industry and also get to survive, to put it bluntly. I mean, this is an emergency. This is truly an emergency. We're in the completely absurd situation at the moment that we're expanding the element of that emergency, which is the worst and the most dangerous, i.e. aviation, including, by the way, through particularly extreme measures such as permitting private jets to mushroom, which are way, way worse even than ordinary jets. We're in an emergency. It seems to me that aviation should swiftly move to being an emergency-only mode of transport, right? Aviation should be for things like mountain rescue or emergency, very rapid transport needed of an organ, or dealing with some kind of international crisis. It shouldn't be for business meetings. They should be all happening on video conference or whatever, or by train now. It shouldn't be for holidays. If we want to take really enjoyable holidays, you can do so by train and by boat and so on. I know because I've been tapering down my air travel for years, and finally this year I've stopped altogether, and I've taken quite a few wonderful holidays by train and other modes, including right across Europe in the last couple of years. The question of offsets, that what Corinne mentioned about bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, I'm very skeptical of this, and I'm not alone. There's an increasing number of studies which seem to indicate that this way of attempting to allow ourselves to continue to emit lots of carbon and allegedly capture it is questionable on all sorts of levels. The one that concerns me the most is that the way that it's proposed that BECCS gets done is typically through creating vast monocultures which are highly climate vulnerable and are ecosystemically highly problematic. Yes, absolutely, we ought to be reforesting the earth, but not in ways that we then keep on cutting down, damaging soil, putting carbon underground in places of questionable safety, for the sake of being able to carry on emitting in ways that are unsafe. So to sum up, coming back to our question of 2025 or 2050, as Corinne says, it is absolutely vital that we know what we're talking about. I would urge that what we should be talking about is including basically everything in the figures, everything that this country is responsible for, and then going for the most ambitious date possible. And I was influenced here recently by listening to the former government scientific advisor, Sir David King, on the radio the other day. Absolutely fascinating, on Radio 4. He was asked, so which do you favour, 2050, 2030, 2025? And he said, well, my preferred date for zero carbon would be in the past. I agree with him. We are in a true emergency situation, so let's take it seriously.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rupert, and thank you very much, Corinne. So I think we should let them have a little exchange now, because they've been sort of, delivering information at you. So when I was doing all those experiments back in the 1860s, I had no idea this was going to be so complicated. So we're going to let them have a bit of an exchange now, but then we're going to come to you, and you can discuss among yourselves what you think. So I guess if I go first with Corinne, is that okay? Just because Rupert, you were the last speaker.
I will be very brief. Can you hear me from here? Just two things I want to say. One thing is about the aviation and whether it should be used or not. I'm thinking about the real world here. I mean, we are in a real world where aviation exists and is available to everybody at a cost. And moving from that real world to the somewhat idealistic world that you're mentioning here would be incredibly difficult. And what I would like to see is a realistic plan for going from this real world to net zero emissions by 2050, and I very much doubt that it goes through the route that you're highlighting. I would say that two things though. In aviation, distance matters, so it's not the short flights that are the most damaging, it's really the long haul. There's a big myth there. And aviation, in the scenarios that limit climate change to net zero, that reach net zero, aviation is the only industry where the demand is limited. So there is a cap on demand in aviation, so aviation is asked to constrain demand. All the other industries, there are options because it is possible for the other industries to have alternative sources of energy. The other thing is about offsets. And the fact that we may have carbon sinks elsewhere that we might want to pay for. Look, we have to change the way that we see land and we manage land. Land has to be sustainably managed. We have to recognize all the resources and services that the land gives us. It's not a matter anymore of just reforesting land and leaving it alone. We're already 7.7 billion on Earth. There will be more of us. Land is going to need to be used. It's going to be used for producing resources, but it's going to have to be used sustainably. So working on this sustainability dimension here in the UK and elsewhere around the world with global system of agreements, we're going to have to do this. Whether we want to pay for this to have our own credits, now I'm with you. I don't think that we should do that, but we should definitely work on sustainable land management worldwide.
Okay, so let me pick up the aviation point. Of course, you're right that what I say about that sounds extremely ambitious. It sounds idealistic. It might be said to sound unrealistic. And there's a repeated refrain in the Committee on Climate Change report earlier this year. It repeatedly says things like, such and such is politically unrealistic, whereas what we're proposing is politically realistic. So my understanding of what movements like Extinction Rebellion and the climate school strikes are seeking to do is precisely to make what seems politically unrealistic, politically realistic. And the way that that is supposed to happen is by achieving a vast shift of consciousness. So that rather than seeking to preserve something like the life as we presently live it, we move rapidly to a quite different form of life, which will make it much more likely that we'll be able to survive and flourish without the collapse of our civilization. And there is some evidence that that shift in consciousness is happening. If you look at opinion polls this year, there's been a striking transformation over the past 12 months in people's attitudes towards climate, towards environment, towards the importance of these things. Most notably after the April Extinction Rebellion, for the first time you had 2/3 of the British population saying, yes, there is a climate emergency. Do I think this transformation has gone far enough? Nowhere near. But it is starting to happen. So maybe within the next few years, what sounds at the moment kind of outlandish, the idea that one might ban flights or find other ways of kind of rapidly and radically reducing them, maybe that idea starts to become more realistic. And it is actually starting to enter into the political agenda. It's being discussed in this general election campaign. Last point, you might still be thinking that Corinne is right when she says, yeah, but nevertheless, it still sounds really hard. It's still incredibly ambitious. It still sounds right now unrealistic. But you see, my big counterclaim, it's a question of the end of the telescope thing again. My big counterclaim would be this. I think it's unrealistic to think that we can safely do the kind of thing that the Committee on Climate Change is talking about and hope to be in 2050 and thereafter in the kind of place that they think we're going to be in. Right? On their own terms, there's a pretty strong chance that we'll be in the unsafe zone. But there's worse. We could discuss this because I think that those terms are themselves unrealistic. My reasoning for that is that I think that the basis, the scientific basis for the claim that we will have even a 45% chance or whatever of remaining safe by 2050 if we do the kind of thing that the Committee on Climate Change is talking about, I think that's questionable. Because I think that the IPCC leans on the conservative and over-optimistic side when it comes to the science, and we could talk about that. So, in other words, when the Committee on Climate Change say we have a greater than 50% chance, even if that's true, I think it's not acceptable, but I also think it's quite unlikely to be true. So what my claim is, the realistic thing to do, as the old anarchists used to say, is at this point to demand what seems impossible and to make it possible. That gives us a better chance, I would claim, of survival and flourishing than going down the kind of more reformist route that Corinne has outlined.
Thank you very much, Rupert, and thank you very much, Corinne. Now I'm going to come to you. In a minute, I'm just going to move them a little way apart from each other. Not because I think they're going to have a fight, but actually it's just because there's feedback. I don't know if you've noticed. That's okay. So I would like you to really talk among yourself to think about this. What is it that you think should be in the net zero target? So we heard from Corinne, we've heard from Rupert, around carbon dioxide, all greenhouse gases, consumption emissions, aviation, lots of other things. So I just want you to do, well, not to do some work now, have a nice conversation for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back to the clickers to gauge what you think. So please, talk to the people next to you, introduce yourselves and have a bit of a chat, and I would like it to be really noisy in here. It's been quiet for quite a long time. So, to try and capture your discussions as best we can, but of course your discussions would have been much more wide-ranging than what we could have thought to put on a slide. So what do you think the net zero target should include? Is it, and you can choose more than one, so we're not being overly restrictive, CO2 only, focus only on energy emissions, greenhouse gases, including agriculture, consumption emissions, it's a big one. So if you buy stuff from abroad, it's your responsibility to cut it. International aviation and shipping, and to allow for international carbon credits. There is plenty of others, and maybe we'll discuss that later. But you can vote A, B, C, D, E, or you can vote for more than one. So please vote now, because I will close the poll in a minute.
You're giving them a bit of time on this one.
Yeah. Hey, you just voted for everything. I just saw that. All done? Anybody else want some more? Right, no, okay. All done now. We captured everybody. Don't want to leave anybody behind. All done? Okay. And to reveal the results. CO2 only. All greenhouse gases. All consumption emissions. I need a mathematician to do some adding for me. International aviation, and to allow for international carbon credits. Well, I have to say.
It's summed to 100%, so it hasn't allowed multiple voting.
So it should have allowed multiple voting? It did allow multiple voting. Okay, so it's set up. So, okay, so, well, actually, give or take a few clicks on the wrong button. So we've got equal pretty much between greenhouse gases, or all greenhouse gases, consumption emissions should be included, and international aviation. So that basically is accounting for pretty much everything. International carbon credits for a little bit, and CO2 only for a little bit. So, like I say, we're interested in what you think. So, well, let's go for, let's represent the minority. CO2 only. Is anybody wanting to tell us why CO2? No. See, it's oh, okay. Right, strike that. Thank you for being so honest. Okay, so we'll just readjust that data then. And well, let's go for all greenhouse gases. Maybe we won't discuss that, but let's go for international aviation. Anybody want to give their version or the discussion they had about why flying should be included? Somebody must have it. It's rubbish if I give you my opinion. Yes, please.
If we're going to leave bits out of our model, what is the point of having it? If there is a cap, there is a total amount of carbon we can produce, or a total amount of CO2 we can produce. What is the point of having things that leaks? We wouldn't accept leaking in any other model.
Okay.
So why don't we allow that?
Okay, so it's a whole. And then we had another hand behind as well, please. Something very similar. Okay. Okay. Super. Please.
When I was at work many years ago, I flew about a dozen times for work, and on no occasion was it necessary. These days, when people tell me that they fly because they had to see a client, I know they didn't have to.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to go one more at the back there. You can hand up longest.
They both represent unnecessary and consumerism, high-end consumerism that can be cut down.
Okay. Yeah, one more.
It's just like, because it's a question of responsibility and whether, which country is going to take responsibility. But I think all countries need to take as much responsibility as they possibly can, because we're all on this lifeboat that's sinking.
Okay, so that was about all countries taking sort of equal responsibility. I said that because just you're off to the side, so just other people might not have heard. I'm going to, I think, move on from there, unless there is another pressing topic that somebody wanted to insert into there. And I think what we'll do now is, oh yeah, there was one more. Thank you. Yeah, I was hoping there would be a bit. I mean, how can it be so silent when we're talking about what goes into the carbon targets?
Shipping represents trade. It's a core economic factor.
International trade.
Yes, and when a lot of our goods from abroad come to here through shipping. So, although we want to reduce the carbon from it, we still need to have trade, but we need to make it more efficient.
Right, okay.
Actually,
So
could
something
Can
different.
I respond to that briefly?
Yeah, I was actually going to come to you for responses anyway. So, Corinne, are you ready for response?
I wasn't on responsive mode.
Shall I
Oh,
just-
okay. Yeah, no, let's let Rupert respond then.
Because that's a very interesting and important observation and question. And I think one of the things you may have in mind there is Britain's kind of self-identity as a trading nation and island nation and so on. My claim would be this. In the future, there is definitely going to be a lot less international trade. There are at least two possible routes towards that destination of less international trade. One is that we decide to drastically reduce the amount of shipping and aviation, by the way. Insanely now, we transport quite a lot of stuff, fresh stuff and other stuff, by plane in the holds of passenger planes. one way of getting to the conclusion, one way to getting to the destination is we intelligently, rapidly reduce the amount of international trade. And we become more self-sufficient. Yeah? The other way is that our society collapses. And if our society collapses, there will definitely be a lot less international trade. But I would much prefer the first route to the second. And in the emergency that we're now in, I think it's that kind of choice that we face again and again.
Well, now that Rupert has spoken, actually, I do have a response to Rupert. In fact, there are alternatives to high carbon shipping in shipping. So it is possible to use hydrogen, for example, in shipping. You can do slow shipping so that you reduce a lot the friction on the ship, and you can have some more engineered type of shipping, like sails on ship, which is a little bit more out of the ordinary. But there are alternatives to shipping. Aviation is the one for which we have few alternatives. So shipping is not by itself a problem because it has alternatives.
Well, my claim would be that we need to reduce, and then what we continue to use, we should do in the kind of ways that you're outlining. But yes, I agree with you. The problems are more fundamental for air travel than for sea travel.
My request to have you sitting apart has done nothing at all to feedback, so if you'd rather be more comfortable, please, Corinne,
I'm good here.
okay, but wherever you're most comfortable, we've still got feedback, and I know that it's been recorded, so that might be a bit annoying to anybody who's listening. Although I am from the 18th century, so I don't actually know that. Right, let's move on to part two. So that was, part one was in terms of the opening speeches, but also kind of the quantitative nature of the targets. You know, what's in and what's out, what should be included, what's not included, and the background to why they are and why they're not. So now let's move more on to part two, which I'm in danger of using this word, gets a little bit more philosophical. I realise I'm actually here with a philosophy professor, so I probably shouldn't have used that word at all. About the more qualitative aspects of why. That was the what, and now we're moving into the why. And this is the philosophy of science, that philosophy of the climate change targets. So again, we'll have addresses from Rupert and Corinne on that topic. You know, it's not the right word. Excuse me, Rupert, for saying philosophy. It's not the principles. And then we'll run through again. You'll have a discussion. We'll have a vote. So Rupert, would you like to open up on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll keep this brief because I've already said a fair bit about this. One quite important aspect of this is that we need to be clear that only so much of this part of the discussion, and this is already implicit in what Ash has said, can come from science. There are ineradicable aspects here that are philosophical, that are ethical, that are political. Yeah? We need to make choices about how important we consider attaining safety to be. A lot of my work is based around the precautionary principle, and what the precautionary principle says basically is that if something is happening which may have catastrophic results, you don't have to wait for proof that it has had catastrophic results or even definitely will have catastrophic results before moving to stop it. I think that when one thinks the precautionary principle through, it makes an awful lot of sense, but that's a debate that needs to be had and can't be settled by the science alone. Similarly with the related ethical questions. How important is the preservation of the rest of life on Earth outside of human life? How important are future generations? My argument about future generations would be that future generations are absolutely everything. That if we don't give the world in a good order to our children, and if they're not able to give it in good order to their children, and so on endlessly, then we're making a serious mistake. We're betraying our nature as mammals, as primates, as human beings. And right now, tragically, I think that is what's happening. We are betraying our nature. We are betraying the future. We are not taking enough care of that future. I think that what economists call the discount rate should be set at 0. What is the discount rate? Basically, it's the amount by which we gradually write off the future by assuming that each year away from now is slightly less important than the year that we are in. I think that's wrong. I think that next year is just as important as this year. I think that our children's lifetime is just as important as our lifetime. So I would suggest that there are principles that we can arrive at here by way of deliberation and the kind of deep thought that philosophers and others engage in. But it's not easy, and there's always going to be debates and issues to be had. The last remark I would make on this is, I alluded earlier to having some dissatisfaction with the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. Well, that partly comes from my philosophy of science background. I think it's troubling, for example, that while for good reason, for understandable reason, the IPCC requires every single statement that any of its papers or authors or whatever make to be absolutely evidentially nailed down. That's a kind of scientific conservatism which is understandable and makes sense from a point of view of science, but it doesn't make so much sense when you're trying to decide how to run a society and how to keep that society safe. Because as I already implied, when you're trying to do that, then you need to apply the precautionary principle. And similarly, one more slightly self-interested remark. I am still slightly troubled by the composition of the IPCC. It's getting better, but the IPCC is still overwhelmingly constituted by atmospheric physicists, geophysicists, and others in related disciplines. There aren't very many ecologists involved in it, and there are hardly any philosophers involved with it. I would like that to change, and I think if that did change, then we might have a more balanced view, which would find a way of integrating some of these principles more into the work of vital bodies such as this one.
Okay, so in your opening statement, Rupert, you said many scientists believe 1.5 degree is the upper range of what is safe for us. So I'm a scientist myself, and I don't know many scientists who believe this. Most scientists say the lower the warming, the lower the risks. Every fraction of a degree matters. The scientists that I know avoid the word safe. You would not imagine. Safe is a very loaded word. It's actually not really a scientific word. It has judgment in the background, a lot of judgment. In fact, a lot of the things we do are not safe. It's not safe to walk in the street. It's not safe to drive a car. Safe is a judgment matter. And for that reason, it is not the scientists who actually decide on the targets for global temperature, on the ambition for global temperature targets. These decisions were made as part of the Paris Agreement, as the biggest decision that has been made by policymakers based on the best available science. So they have looked at what the scientists have said, what the impacts of various degrees of warming will do. These politicians, through the UNFCCC, which regulates international processes on climate change, have asked the scientists to produce a report on 1.5 degree warming, and the scientists have produced the report. It doesn't mean that the scientists have said 1.5 degrees at all costs. It means that the scientists have answered the question to the government. Based on that report, the government have said in the Paris Agreement, we will aim to limit warming well below 2 degrees and pursue effort to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So this is the judgment call by world politicians of what the global effort should aim at. This might change with further scientific evidence, but this is where we stand now. The numbers that have changed, so Rupert mentioned this 2025 target at the beginning. There are two reasons why he come for a different number. The first one is because he uses 1.5 degree with 66% at 1.5 degrees, whereas the interpretation of the Paris Agreement that I would make is that 1.5 degree is a 1.5 degree. And the other, so not as a threshold, but as a number of warming. And the other reason is because of what is a fair UK contribution to the global burden. And this is, again, a really very difficult question. But any concept of fairness all have this in common, that the UK contribution has to be more ambitious than the world contribution. How much more ambitious is really difficult to say. On some metrics, if you take the industrial, or all the wealth built over through the industrial period, you could say that we've already done everything we could. We should stop our emissions now. And based on which metric actually you use, you get different burden. I think with having a chance of 1.5 degrees, 50% chance of 1.5 degrees worldwide means that the full greenhouse gas emissions need to reach net zero by 2070, the UK having its contribution by 2050. If we take this as a starting point, so global net zero full greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 for a limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees 50-50, then what should the UK contribution be what should the UK contribution be? It's up to us to decide. And there is where you actually want the UK contribution to be as strong as possible, as strong as it can possibly be. And there comes the realism bit. So how strong, how fast can the UK reduce its emissions to net zero? And there you have to start thinking about what are the options that we have and how fast can we go with the recognizing the situation we are starting from. And so the first principle is the realism in what we try to achieve. Now, I want to dispel a myth straight away. Innovation is great, but innovation is not going to save us. Typically, it takes 10 to 20 years from invention to production, and an additional 10 to 20 years from production to widespread uptake of a new technology. So what we see in front of us is what we're going to have to deal with in the next 30 years. Timescales are shorter for products that are smaller, but nevertheless, this is the kind of timescale that we have to take care of. And if we do make a plan based on the technology that we have today with foreseeable improvements in those technology, and then new technologies come up, great. There is, of course, the possibility that new technologies come up will emit more CO2 and not less. Think of the Bitcoin, for example. Another thing that takes time is social responses. Although we have seen this year school strikes for climate, we have also seen social response that have been in response to the transition to a low carbon economy. The success so far in reducing emissions in this country in particular has been in the production of energy, but not in those difficult things that affect all of us, like transport, like heating, like food. We haven't really started to tackle these sectors yet. And when we start to tackle these sectors, it will start to affect a lot of people, in fact, everybody around the world. What we have seen in the last year, opposition measures that have taken place in the last 12 months, including in countries that support big, strong responses to climate change. In France, the Yellow Jacket protests were triggered by the increase in fuel tax, and that brought hundreds of thousands of people in the street, tens of thousands over the course of half a year, because of the rise in fuel tax that was there to tackle climate change, specifically recommended by economists and scientists to tackle climate change, and that has set back the advancement of measures in France. In Ecuador, 5 days of protest last month in response to government removing fossil fuel subsidies after recommendation from the United Nations. The country was at a halt. In the Netherlands, farmers took to the street with their tractors, completely blocking the traffic in protest against measures to reduce nitrogen in agriculture and shut down inefficient cattle farms. The farmers were angry. They were angry to be blamed for the climate crisis. They feed us, remember. That's what they said, and they do. This is all happening in spite of support for climate action. Social change takes time. We do not understand much of it, recognizing that there's more to be done there. And we also need to be realistic, and history and social science can guide us here. Other points, can I have a few more? Very quick.
I'll give you 1 minute.
Okay. The UK cannot act alone, so just the UK acting won't stabilize climate, so it has to be a global process. The Paris Agreement is a masterpiece of diplomacy. We need to let it do its work. Next year is the first challenge where countries are asked to ratchet mechanism, and I hope that this will come. When it is appropriate to strengthen the target and to bring it forward, there might come a time when it is appropriate to do so, and I will be more than happy at that time to support it. And my very last point is that I think there are risks also for going too fast, and the main one is in the way that we manage vegetation and the biosphere.
Thank you, Corinne. Rupert, just come back
Just
quickly.
briefly on the safety stuff, just to avoid misunderstanding. So I wasn't meaning to say, certainly, that we need to achieve 1.5 degrees at all costs, and nor did I mean that 1.5 would guarantee safety. What I meant was something like this, that many scientists, as I understand it, think that given where we are now, we should definitely be serious in our aim of seeking to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And one reason for that, which we haven't really touched on yet, is the terrible danger of feedbacks, such as a massive methane release, albedo loss of whiteness in the Arctic. And these feedbacks, again, suggest on balance, it seems to me, that the messages that people get from the IPCC reports tend, if anything, to be over-optimistic and insufficiently raising the alarm. Corinne is quite right that safe is not a scientific word. We are here into the discussion of principles, and that's part of what I meant to be contributing to. Just one specific point: it's not true that you can simply say it's unsafe to walk in the street, because it is, of course, safer to walk in the street than not to walk in the street, right? If not walking the street means you just stay at home all the time, you don't get any exercise, etc. So that's not a good reason for thinking that there's something wrong with precautionary thinking. Final point, the point that we keep on coming back to, I think, in terms of a disagreement, is around this question of realism. And I would say, again, we need to change what appears realistic. Otherwise, I think we are basically finished. It's true to say that there is a danger that if you go in an inappropriate way towards these objectives, then you will have no realistic way of getting there. That's why, for example, Extinction Rebellion argues that climate justice is absolutely crucial to avoid the kind of gilets jaunes phenomenon. So part of what it is to be realistic in the way that one has very ambitious aims is that one has to do it in a way that is just. And I would say that that's what we should do. We should aim really, really high in a way that is just. I would say that Paris is not enough. Britain should go further, and we should try to actually inspire the world by showing finally a little bit of genuine leadership in this area.
Thanks very much. There is a salsa class going on, isn't there? It's not tinnitus. There is something else going on. We didn't choreograph that, did we? No, okay. Just thought I'd clarify that. I think it's time for you to have a chat now. Again, we've had absolutely fascinating, detailed discussion, but this isn't just about the speakers here. So I would like you to, again, chat with your friends and your colleagues and the people sitting next to you. Maybe you vehemently disagree. That would be most interesting. So it's same question. What are the principles that should guide decisions on climate change? Yeah, the philosophy, the ethics, the scientific aspects. So if you could just talk about that, you know, what do you really think is the underpinning thinking behind what should guide carbon budgets and the climate change target? So if you do that now, introduce yourself, same people, different people, and then we'll come back to you again. So I'm going to ask you that question as of the clickers, and of course we're trying to prejudge what you were discussing about, which is pretty impossible. Voting is open. What are the principles? This is a one only?
Yes.
This is a one only. So what are the principles that should guide decisions on climate objectives? A, B, C, D. Whatever it takes to stop climate change as soon as possible, we'll figure it out. The UK has responsibility to act and should set the strongest possible targets. I'm okay with assuming new technology will emerge. The objectives need to be ambitious, but they also need to be feasible. It is too risky to set targets without knowing if they can be met. And the UK should not set targets that are more ambitious than the rest of the world. Now, I know there's more than 4 things to be thinking about here, but if you could vote, please. Everybody voted? We know who you are if you haven't voted.
No, this needs more consideration.
Why is that? It is a one vote, yes. Yes, I realise it is a difficult. The priority, perhaps. All done? Everybody done? Yeah. I don't want to leave anybody behind. Everybody done? Right, closed. And the answer is, if I can get this technology to work, you're the most decisive, undecisive, I'm not quite sure. But given that you only had to vote for one, that's quite interesting. You can see the results for yourself. Let's just consider them even, because I think if we go down into percents, we're probably not really there. The UK should not set targets that are more ambitious than the rest of the world. That's interesting. That was a 1%. And the others are even. So it's whatever it takes to stop climate change, 34%, 31%, 35%. I don't think I have a need to discuss those right now. Oh, but there's a hand come up. No, if you wish to discuss, then please do.
I wonder whether because we're talking about realism. We're talking about realism, or you've brought it up, and we have 50% who are almost students. I'd love to know whether they are whether we as older people are just way more cautious, and you as young people would actually like us all to just do more. I don't know whether we can ask that.
Although, as I said earlier, of course, it's always a question of cautious about what, right? So you mean cautious about rapid change or something, whereas my argument would be we need to be cautious about having a future.
And the clickers do take your thumbprint as well as a DNA sample, so we know everything about you, so we will be doing further analysis a little bit later. I think, Corinne, would you like to respond on any of these?
It's interesting. I mean, there's not much grey to this, right? Because A and B are somewhat, it's just like somewhat the same, but there are some nuances there. I do think, I recognize the sort of desire to act as quickly as possible, and I recognize that technology will evolve in our lifetime. It has evolved in the past 30 years, and it will evolve. And I do hope that we get in a position where we can actually strengthen that target, perhaps not through the year, perhaps by adding some additional element of international collaboration to it and so on. I think this is really quite interesting. I have no deep thought, actually, on this today. I'm glad that there was not so many people who answered D.
Rupert, please.
Yeah, so we're agreed on D. I would have voted for A, although I must say I don't think we can guarantee, tragically, that we will figure it out. I think that we're in an area of uncertainty, and it's going to be incredibly, incredibly hard to actually get through this successfully. This is the first vote this evening where I'm kind of a bit disappointed with the vote, though, because I'm a bit surprised that so many people voted for B and C, which I think are both inadequate. Of course, yeah, there will be some new technologies, but I take it that B is saying, well, the new technologies are going to sort the thing out. I think that's a real gamble. And on C, what I would say is this. I would say it's not too risky to set targets without knowing if they can be met, because a target is something that you aim for. And sometimes the right thing to do is to aim for something, even if you don't know how you're going to meet it, or even if you can meet it. So think about the wartime situation, right? You don't have Churchill and his generals or something sitting around having a discussion. Can we beat Hitler? Well, we're not sure, so let's not try, right? They were unsure, so they threw themselves into it, everything they had, and tried to succeed, and luckily for us, they did. That actually is the kind of analogy I think we should be building on. Yeah? We don't know whether we're going to make it. We don't know whether we can make it. But we should nevertheless throw everything into trying to make it.
I think, I mean, on this issue of what the target means, maybe we should have addressed this in the discussion. Yes, indeed, people have various sort of element of risk, whether you're happy to set a target and not meet it. In this case, the UK target is a legally binding net zero target. So if it fails, then the government will be in court and there will be lots of consequences to it. So perhaps this is not quite the same. The UK legally binding target is perhaps not quite the same as the target that would actually drive us here in this room tonight.
But surely the question of whether or not we maximize our chances of saving our civilization is more important than the question of whether or not the UK government ends up in court.
Certainly, but this resides in the action, not in the target.
I'm going to open it out to the floor now. So this is really where this is the discussion now. So sorry, put your hands down for now, because you're going to get achy arms otherwise. Everybody will get questions, so get to ask questions. Don't worry. But first of all, when I was pleased to see that Aldi's stock carbon budget analogies, because these fruit chews are perfect for sharing. So take one and pass it back, and it's completely up to you. Do I get back the same amount of sweets that I gave out, or are some of you going to take more, or are some are going to take less? So this is part of the experiment as well. You don't have to take any. It might, or yeah. So please don't have it if you can't eat sugar, because I suspect they're quite full of sugar. And if I get back more fruit chews than I gave out, then we have to rethink climate change targets, basically, if this is what the result will be there. So, opening up to questions, we have Tom over here and Natalie. Where did Natalie go? Oh, and Natalie there, who are very kindly your microphone helper people. Tom, you've got 3 hands right next to you, so please could you take all 3 of those? We'll do questions together, and then we'll do them in lumps. If that.
Okay.
You're very welcome to say who you are, but...
Yeah, that's fine. I'm Emily. Okay, I'm quite nervous, but more angry than nervous, so I'm going to say something. Okay, we have an emergency here, right? This is really, really serious. And I know we have to talk about things, but something came up in our conversation, and I want to share it, okay? We have got a world that... we've just had Halloween, take this for example, okay? How many people have gone out and bought costumes that they have just thrown away, right? They would not be doing this, I don't think, if they realised how serious the situation is. Now, we take the tax in France, okay? It was a really good idea. There was tax put on fuel. Possibly we shouldn't be targeting people. We should probably be targeting businesses before we target people. But I'm sure if things were explained, if the government took this situation seriously, if the media took this situation seriously, and if people were being told daily, take, like, for example, the Cold War. When people were living under the Cold War, German children in school were taught how they needed to react if there was a nuclear bomb, right? We're talking this situation, it's that serious. We're talking like a nuclear bomb's going to go off. Now, if people were taught about this, then I don't think they would be going out and buying Halloween costumes that they then throw away the next day. I think people would dramatically change the way they live. So I think we need to find some way of educating people, getting the government to educating people, getting the media to start educating people. And I think the change we could make, I mean, people could probably buy 30% of what they buy every year easily and still live pretty damn good lives. And that would have a huge effect. So that's just my point, really.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. If you could just keep your hands up so Tom can see where he's coming with the microphone.
So I think I might have misread C, because I read that as there's a risk if you set your target too far away of inertia being built up before you actually seriously started addressing it. So if you set your target near, like when Hitler was around, you said, right, we need to deal with that now. If you say somebody like Hitler's going to turn up in 20 years, you're not going to do anything about it for 10, and that means your decline of carbon needs to be much, much steeper. I just think there's a risk of people not taking it seriously, and I think potentially we have some people in charge now who aren't taking it very seriously because their political careers are going to be over long before they have to actually feel the bite of real change, or they think there is, or they think there are, and I think there's a danger of inertia in setting your targets too far away.
There's a couple of things I wanted to say. One was I think that the answers to this question is not very well written because, A, they're a bit vague, like somebody's misunderstood what we mean about targets being risky, but also, B, about okay with assuming new technology will emerge. We don't need new technology. We need the willpower to change our lives. We have the technology for net zero. We just aren't using it. Or just not accepting that we need to reduce our consumption and stop flying on holidays and so forth. So it's not about technology. So, that's just... I feel the first part of answer B is perfectly reasonable and the second part of answer B doesn't make any sense.
I'm going to move the clickers on so that we don't overanalyze these questions too much.
Okay.
This is an overall discussion.
However,
there was. Oh, sorry. Did you have one more?
Yeah, I don't think. This is slightly playing devil's advocate, right? We're a room full of people, 80% of whom said the target should be 2025, and from what people have said, we all seem to be in favour of, really taking action and really making the changes necessary. But I wonder how many of us say that, but we don't act it. So I would like to do a show of hands who in this room has bought something unnecessary in the last month. So Halloween costumes, a pair of shoes to match your favourite outfit, a new scarf when you already have 3, I don't know, chocolate. Chocolate is not necessary. Okay, who in this room has bought something unnecessary in the last month? Put your hands up. I reckon that's about half, and I bet some of the rest of you aren't being honest.
It's remarkable how radical lifestyle change always comes down to not eating chocolate. Can we have some questions over here? Closer to Natalie. Could you take 3, please, Natalie?
Hello?
Yes,
That one?
we got
Yeah.
you.
I want to sort of come in on this thing about new technology will emerge, because that is actually one of the sort of biggest risks in all this, and it's really the elephant in the room. If you look at the Paris Agreement, and then you look at the IPCC 1.5 degree report, and the Committee on Climate Change report that followed it, they're all predicated on negative emissions, and that essentially is what, if you like, the climate establishment, which you represent, Corinne, is saying. And to put it simply, it's actually a charter for the fossil fuel industry on the basis that basically don't alter the targets which were sort of set back a decade or 2 decades ago, the real reduction targets significantly, but instead bring in negative emissions technology. And Rupert's already alluded to some of the risks in that. With, for example, BECCS. But I'd like to ask you if you saw the Mark Jacobson paper last week on CCS, carbon capture and storage. Mark Jacobson from Stanford. He analysed the full carbon life cycle of carbon capture storage systems on energy systems in the US, in fact based on coal, but the principles apply to biomass too. and actually found that the efficiency was in carbon saving was about 10%. And when you take that into account, it's actually better from a carbon point of view just to invest in renewable energy and not to keep power stations going, either burning coal or biomass. And really, we're sort of, we're gambling on, with BECCS, we're gambling on an idea which just hasn't been scrutinised. And basically, I just want to ask the panellists, but particularly you, Corinne, so, what are you going to do when CCS doesn't deliver this? Paris is torn up then, because it's in one of the Paris, literally in one of the legal bits of Paris. It underwrites the IPCC report and the CCC. Basically, we're all going to overshoot because of this, and really you have to scrutinise this. And when you look at that, the only solution is how are you going to reduce emissions quickly enough? I would put it to you, but I'll ask you a question. What are you going to do when CCS doesn't deliver?
Great, thanks. Can we have, if we can have pithy questions, because we can't try and get as many in as possible. So Natalie, could you take the microphone back? Oh, sorry. Could you go? Yeah, just up there, please.
Thank you. Natasha here, sort of following on from that question, but I wanted to ask a bit about the climate governance mechanisms and your opinions around these. We haven't had any questioning of this Paris Agreement so far, and I just wanted to point out that that agreement is not binding and enforceable. That is a request for countries, a kind of pledge that they've made to meet certain targets by certain dates, and they will be measuring this every so often in terms of how they're meeting their nationally determined contributions. So I wanted to ask, we kind of mentioning this as, this is a great thing, the Paris Agreement and so on, but we really must look at that, and what does that actually mean? And I wanted to ask you specifically, Corinne, about the enforcement mechanisms for these UK targets, because clearly we can take whatever 2050 or 2025 target and bring it back to the annual targets and measure against that annually, which the CCC is doing, as I understand. But what are the enforcement mechanisms that are being put in place, can be put in place, that are legally binding for not only the UK, but other countries to meet this?
Thanks very much. So I'm just going to recap, and then if I could ask the speakers to come back with some suitably pithy responses. Do you want to recap? Have you got? Do I need to?
Why don't we just plunge in?
Yeah, you've got it, Corinne. You got it.
Yeah.
Okay. In that case, I won't do that bit. So, Rupert, would you like to step in?
Well, I'd like to say first, what an absolutely superb set of questions. I pretty much agree with pretty much everything that all the questioners said. So I could just stop there, but I do have a few little points. Firstly, on the Paris Agreement, I did actually say Paris is not enough. And if you watch one of my full-length talks online, most of them go in some detail as to why Paris is not enough. I think Corinne put it very well earlier. Paris was an extraordinary diplomatic achievement. It was amazing that it was agreed. But that just shows you how desperate our situation is, that was the best that could be agreed. And that is exactly why we need a far higher level of ambition. And that is why we need people-powered movements to completely move the Overton window and shift consciousness. Otherwise, we're pretty much done. On that, I would say that the most important action that we can take is not buying Halloween costumes. I mean, good, don't buy Halloween costumes unnecessarily. But the most important action we can take is what we do together, socially and politically. Yeah? Education is important, but the real game changer is going to be if we get massive politically and ecologically driven social change. And then back to the first question. Absolutely. With the Cold War, we didn't keep that from children. And I'm still worried that actually there's a nervousness around letting children understand, certainly children of about 10 years and older. 10 years is the age of criminal responsibility in this country. I think if you're old enough to go to jail, you're old enough to be told the truth about how desperate our plight is. We didn't keep the Cold War from children. I think we're still keeping climate reality from children too much. I'm absolutely inspired by the school climate strikers. And what they say to me over and over again is, even if it's difficult and uncomfortable, please don't hold back. Tell us the truth as you see it. And that's the final point I'd like to make, which is that one of the essential demands of Extinction Rebellion is that government needs to declare a near-term emergency. So it's not enough to have Parliament passing that bill that they passed, which is basically just symbolic. We need government to say, this is a dire emergency. It's here now. It's not ways off in the future sometime. It's here now because what we do now is going to affect our kids really badly. And it's here now because right now we're making ourselves terribly vulnerable through crop failure, etc. I want the Prime Minister to go on national television on all channels simultaneously and address the British people to say this. I want public information leaflets through every single door. That's the kind of thing we're going to do if we mean it, that this is an emergency. And as you say, also very much the media. The media needs to declare emergency. Everybody needs to declare emergency. But it needs to start, really, if we're actually going to get serious about it, with the media and the government.
Corinne, please.
On the Halloween question, we live in an incoherent society that actually has not yet recognized this threat and this necessity of urgent action. And it's true that we need to actually change or complement or top up the education program. We need that all the decisions are coherent in policies across all the ministries, coherent with the need for net zero emission and the timeline that's attached to this. I mean, just as a circumstantial evidence, I've just became a British citizen for reasons that you can probably guess, and Life in the UK book has half a page on the environment. It doesn't mention the Climate Change Act at all, and it says absolutely nothing about the UK targets or the Paris Agreement. And this is the kind of thing that it should infiltrate all the society, really, so that the information is obvious there. Whether people would actually react if they have the information, I think that's not so obvious to me, but at least the information should be there. On the 2050, who mentioned the 2050 target and will do nothing for 20 years? This is such the crux of my frustration. I mean, the 2050 is the end target. That's the date where things should be zero. It's not the date where we start. We don't start in 2045 and then in 2050 it's net zero. We start now, today, and then we have a chance in 2050 to have net zero. This is so frustrating. And it's true. It's true that this is how people, maybe mentally we behave. Maybe we need to break it down more. I don't know. Next year, the Committee on Climate Change will set the 6th carbon budget for the UK, and maybe that will be the opportunity. The question was perhaps not as well written as it should have been. Mea culpa, I'm sorry. CCS and BECS. This is based at the moment on the best available science, that there will be availability of BECS. It is not technology super challenging. We have the technology, whether it is efficient to the level that is assumed at model on model, and whether there's the land availability for that. This is a different question. The carbon capture and storage bit is not as problematic as we thought it would be initially. This is the best available science, but we badly need demonstration plans for this. We need to put it in practice to see, is the carbon going down, is the cost manageable, and so on. So that's and if in 10 years it hasn't worked, then the plan will need to be revised very, very quickly. Questioning the Paris Agreement and governance. We don't have a world government. We don't. We live in this world where we have national governments, and we like it. We like that the law is national. And so the fact that it's not binding internationally, it's maybe not that the problem. What the incentive should be is like what happened in the UK, and it is happening across the world, is the countries make international pledges, then they come back to their country, and there they make binding agreement, like the UK Climate Change Act.
We are on time. Thank you very much, Rupert and Corinne. So I'm kind of debating whether I should take any more questions, but okay, one went up there really quickly. You were in there first, please.
Well, thank you, both speakers, and my question is really to Corinne. You will no doubt have heard of Jem Bendell, who's written a paper on deep adaptation, Professor of Sustainable Development at Cumbria.
Quick question.
I wonder if you'd have
everybody else from their home.
I wonder if you'd have a comment on his view of the extreme emergency he sees us in. And secondly, you hinted at climate tipping points, but you didn't emphasize the seriousness of them. We have crossed at least one tipping point, the melting of polar ice. There's no chance of refreezing that. So that warming from there, and it comes from many different sources, not least of which is albedo, methane emissions, Arctic fires within the Arctic Circle. I'm just wondering what you think. If we really have crossed that, we're in a very serious situation. And I would like you to comment on that if you would.
Lovely, thank you very much. And a quick question from the woman here as well, please.
Is there an elephant in the room, which is population control? Not been mentioned by our speakers tonight.
But that was a very good, pithy question. Thank you very much. Let's just take those two quickly if you wish to respond.
I have not heard about this book, I'm sorry. On tipping point, what was the question? Whether we have...
Arctic sea ice.
I had an answer. Can you answer? Because I had a good answer and I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, so, well, as I hinted earlier, I am very concerned about feedbacks, especially, but not only in the Arctic. I'm very concerned about the situation in the Amazon, which seems to be becoming incredibly perilous. I think these are reasons strengthening the thought which I've pressed, which is that we ought to go for a very, very ambitious date. And as I was trying to explain earlier, we're very short of time. I think that the way that the scientific community has presented the risks around feedback so far is not right from the perspective of society. So even if these feedbacks are in some cases quite uncertain, such as the methane feedback, right? If the potential downside is sufficiently huge, if we're exposed to enormous catastrophic risk, which we are, if it turns out that there's going to be major ongoing methane release from the melting of the permafrost and so forth, then that mandates strong, precautious action, even if you don't know yet, just how bad the situation is going to be. So I think that the feedbacks should encourage us to push harder towards an early date. On population, it's a huge question. Very, very briefly, if we don't get this right, there will be vast population control on us, again, imposed by nature. So sure, I think there's good reasons to think that we ought to be aiming to not allow the human population to go through the roof. How you do that is another question. Of course, we know that there are ways of doing it that are successful to do with female literacy and so on and so forth. It's a big challenge, but yeah, in various ways, I think it's obviously going to be beneficial if we can restrain the world's population. By the way, the most important places to keep the population low are not places which have the highest birth rates, they're places which have the highest consumption rates.
Corinne?
Just on that issue of tipping point, there are tipping points in the climate system at various stages. Whether the Arctic is a tipping point or not, that's a little unclear. But what is important, in fact, to understand is that the climate change that we have provoked so far is irreversible on our sort of practical time scale. So we've had already 1 degree of warming. Anything we'll have, whatever, is there to stay. Even if we stop the emissions to 0, then we're talking about stabilizing the climate here. So the climate will change, has changed, and it's about establishing a new equilibrium that will support us as a world population. And so we need to sort of work with that world onwards. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We are on time, and so I'm going to wrap up a bit quicker than probably I intended. This was the last question. This is a question when you came in. This is the question as you're going out. So please use your clickers once again very quickly to answer this. So A, target should be set to 2030 or sooner. 250 is fine. Don't know. Everybody voted? Yeah, good. Okay, so now that is interesting because we did write down the results somewhere. If I can find a piece of paper. Where's Natalie with the piece of paper? Thank you very much. So, okay. So when you came into the room, the target should be set was 80%. The target should be set to 2030 or sooner was 80%. When you came into the room, 15% thought that the target should be around 250, and whether scientists and politicians sort it out for you don't know is about the same. That was 5-6%. So the target year has gone up, if you like. So less people think it should be sooner. The 250 has, as you would expect, increased. More people think a target year of 250 is fine, and the other one stays around the same. So the last 2 hours did achieve something in terms of informing people in a different way. I'm not saying that the achievement is the right one or the wrong one. I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight on a November evening. I will be going, I don't know, I might go back to the White House and haunt there. So thank you very much. Do put your feedback in on this link. I guess the link will be circulated on Eventbrite as well. I have some thank yous because, well, a lot of work goes into these things. So here is some refreshments for Corinne, Rupert, and Natalie here. Could we have a boy from Natalie? Because Natalie did all the background work. The carbon budget, so what's that? About a third. So we've got about a third carbon budget left than we shared out a little bit earlier. I've been John Tyndall, also Asher Binns. I'd also like to thank my trousers for staying up throughout the duration of this event. Thank you ever so for joining us. Thank you, Rupert. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you all for coming and taking part. And this is one ClimateUEA event. There will be others. Please follow and see what we're up to. And in particular, thank you very much to all the students who came. Good night.
If you want the book, down the front, it's just a tenner.